For many, Prague Zoo is considered to be among the very best zoos in the world. And it's easy to see why. First of all, Zoo Prague is a very big zoo, 58 hectares in size. And it also houses a lot of different animal species, almost everything you expect to see in a zoo, and also a lot of animal species you can rarely find anywhere else. And yes, there are a number of very modern and great exhibits, yet not everything is perfect either, or to be quite frank, I think a lot of the older exhibits are kind of mediocre. So how good is Prague Zoo really? Let's take a closer look, but first of all, let me know what you think. Is Zoo Prague among the very best zoos in the world? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments down below. And so we start our journey at the main entrance, of course, which is a little inconspicuous for such a prestigious zoo. However, I do like this idea of an animal walk of fame. Once you've entered the park, you can go in various different directions. In this video, we are going to start with the lower part of the zoo and work our way up, because that way we will save the best for last. However, the Lemur Island is also a great way to start our journey. As you can see, it's a walk-in enclosure for ring-tailed lemurs, which is very well structured. Visitors are restricted to the middle part of the enclosure, while the lemurs have a lot of space to the left and to the right, where you can still see them, yet they can keep their distance. And thanks to the lush greenery and the water elements, this is also just a very beautiful enclosure in my opinion. I also really enjoyed the scenery surrounding the fur seal enclosure, and the grandstand in front of it is a pleasant place to linger. And yes, of course you can watch the seals underwater. But there is also an overview of the enclosure, which originally opened in the early 90s, and even though it underwent extensive remodeling and expansion in 2009, the enclosure itself remains mid-sized and kind of basic. Even though the penguin enclosure next door has a similar story, I liked it a lot more. This was last renovated 20 years ago in 2004, but it is still quite spacious and has a nice natural grass area. And the most unique part of the enclosure are those indoor areas, which are very uncommon for Humboldt penguins, and here I think you can still kind of tell that this was originally opened in 1986. There are also a lot of aviaries in this part of the zoo. These are home to a wide variety of bird species, and the hornbills alone will give you an idea of how big the animal collection really is here. 6 different species live here, some of which are kept very rarely. For example, the Luzon hornbill can only be found in 5 different zoos across Europe. The aviaries they live in, however, are once again nothing to write home about. But fortunately, the birds of prey aviaries are a whole lot bigger. And passing stellar sea eagles, bald eagles, king vultures and more, we then enter a beautiful part of the zoo, which is labeled on the map as Water World and Monkey Islands. And at least the last part is self-explanatory. Yes, there are traditional monkey islands here, on which you can find spider monkeys, squirrel monkeys, and silvery gibbons, which thankfully were very active. The 2 youngsters in particular jumped wildly through the enclosure, and marveling at the acrobatic skills of the gibbons in this wonderfully green setting was definitely a highlight. The Water World section does not refer to an aquarium, but to various animals that live in wetlands and near rivers. For example, Malayan tapirs, Saitatangas, or flamingos are living here. They all live in beautifully designed enclosures that harmonize wonderfully with each other. Therefore, this might actually be the most beautiful part of the zoo for me. And my highlight in this area are definitely the Indian gavials. You can only find them in 8 different zoos in Europe, so I was very happy to see them quite active. And thanks to the glass view, you can also watch them wonderfully underwater water while diving. The next area of the zoo is not quite as spectacular. The children's zoo obviously mostly consists of a farm area where the animals kind of went nuts because it was feeding time. Overall, this is also a very well-designed area. It is particularly idyllic around this pond, and the many frogs also gave us a free concert. I also like this aviary with native birds, even though many visitors are sure to ignore it. But please don't ignore the Sichuan Pavilion, which was only reopened in 2023. It's a beautiful habitat for various birds from Asia and especially the Himalayan region. Due to its long tail feathers, I found the great argus particularly impressive. But as you can see, there are a lot of different species to be found here. Not far away is the home of the giant tortoises, which have a large outdoor enclosure, as well as a spacious indoor area, which can be viewed wonderfully through a glass facade. Here you will also find Komodo dragons, and while I never questioned the climbing skills of other monitor lizards, this youngster surprised me a little with his excursion. Back outside there is another lemur island, this time for black and white ruffed lemurs, and behind that lies the old gorilla habitat. In 2022 a new facility for a newly assembled breeding group was opened in the upper part of the zoo. Prague Zoo is consistently relocating many animals from the lower part of the park up to the upper part, as the nearby Vltava river has devastatingly flooded large parts of the zoo several times in the past. The worst flood in 2002 cost the life of 134 animals, and accordingly this event is a turning point in the history of the zoo. Thankfully, the precautionary measures and relocations that were taken meant that yet another flood in 2013 went largely without fatalities. Nevertheless, gorillas are still living down here, a group of bachelors centered around the old silverback Richard, and their enclosure, which was opened in 2001, still makes a very good impression. The indoor enclosures are also very well designed, and right next to it you can also find the tree hyraxes. Back in the open air, we pass a large natural cheetah enclosure and make our way to the feline and reptile house. This is kind of an unusual combination, but yes, right next to the big cats you can also find quite a lot of reptiles here, including Cuban ground iguanas or eastern diamondback rattlesnakes. For many people here, however, they are more of an accessory next to the big cats of prey. There are clouded leopards, Indian lions, Sumatran tigers, and even one of the last Malayan tigers in all of Europe. And there are also a few small cats like fishing cats or Jeffroy's cats. However, as you may have already seen, neither the house nor the outdoor facilities impress with their modern design and layout. This house was opened in 1991, and even though there were major reconstructions in 2004 and 2012, you can still definitely tell that it's more than 30 years old. That doesn't mean it's bad, it's still functional and the enclosures are quite well equipped for the animals, but it's also far from being outstanding. The ratio of the drained moat and the land area alone is simply out of date. The small cat enclosures look more modern, and though they are also not perfect, I do like them better overall. The age of this area is overall all the more striking, as the giant salamander house right next door is a very modern animal house. It was opened in 2014 for 33 giant salamanders, the largest population in Europe. But so far there has been no success in breeding, which to be fair is also considered very difficult. As you can see, the inside of the house is designed like a cave and offers exciting views of these giant amphibians. Behind the feline and reptile house is a very natural looking area called the bird wetland. Several species of cranes live here in beautiful meadow enclosures, and there are also really well designed walk-in aviaries for ibises and more. But the stars of this area are definitely the shoebills. Such magnificent birds who are actually not really storks, even though they are also called shoebill stork or whale-headed stork, but genetically they are more closely related to pelicans and herons. As with the giant salamanders, Prague Zoo is hoping for breeding success in the near future, but let's just say there's a reason why you can only find them in 5 European zoos at the moment. And by the way, can anyone explain those Brazilian flags to me? I mean, shoebills are from Africa, so I'm confused. Anyway, now we come to a steep stone cliff, which is probably one of the most striking and iconic landscape elements in Prague Zoo. And it is also used for very natural enclosures for mountain animals. And seeing tars or turs, Barbary sheep or Barbary monkeys in this sort of environment is just amazing, especially when they decide to show off how well they can climb. Obviously, exhibits like this can only exist if you have the right, well, landscape for it, and as good as artificial mountain landscapes a la Hagenbeck can be, it is of course always more breathtaking when the rocks are real. Famously, there is also a chairlift here that you can take up the cliff or back down again, and I think riding it should be on your zoo bucket list, but guess what this idiot didn't do? To be fair, I thought we were coming back for a third visit, but instead we then went to Zoo Jihlava, which means you're going to get to see a whole other zoo instead of this, so I hope you can forgive me. Anyway, along the cliff there are also some aviaries, starting with this one for bearded vultures, and as you can see here, the aviaries really benefit from being built just alongside the cliff, and since this is also a walk-in aviary, I really had a great time watching the birds here, and as you can tell, there are not just ibises here like hermit ibises. And yellow-billed storks were actually once considered to be an ibis, but they are not. And hammerkops are in fact the closest relatives to shoebills. Then there are the so-called aviaries under the cliff, which are also accessible to visitors. Here, however, the visitor path is elevated and you can look down onto the rest of the aviary. But as the birds are used to people, they also like to sit on the railing up here, so you can get really close to them. And sometimes they sit here almost like they want to present themselves. And why wouldn't they? There are some really beautiful species here, such as bishop storks and giant herons, both of which are rarely kept in zoos. Last but not least, there is the Great Aviary, which is also a walk-in aviary, although effectively it's more like you can look into it. But of course you can still observe the vulture species that are living here very well. And once again, the enclosure benefits incredibly from the fact that it was simply built on a real cliff. Next up, we're heading for the Darwin Crater, an Australian-themed area which was only opened in 2020. Here we start with 2 more aviaries housing parakeets and other Australian birds. You can once again get inside of one of the aviaries, and here I have to show you the modern lock system which ensures that only one of the doors is open at a time. I've never seen it like this in any other zoo, and I think it's quite clever. Also, I need to highlight the little pied cormorants because they can only be found in 2 other zoos in all of Europe. The path then leads us between the enclosures of wombats and Tasmanian devils, and their enclosures in particular are really beautifully designed. Unfortunately, the animals didn't show themselves, but thankfully I can fall back on video footage that I shot at Zoo Plankendahl in Belgium. We also had no luck in the indoor enclosures. The echidnas didn't want to show themselves either, so we can finish off the Darwin Crater rather quickly with this walk-through kangaroo enclosure. All in all, a really well-prepared area where you will hopefully have more luck with the animals. But as compensation, the lowland tapirs were very active and also a bit horny, even though I didn't see any mating in the end. Nope. And with that, we've arrived at the Dja Reserve. This is where the pachyderms used to live. You know, the footage you saw earlier, that was here. However, nowadays, this area mainly consists of a playground. But behind it, somewhat hidden, is the terrarium. Here, of course, you will find a lot of reptiles, mainly snakes. For example, Vietnamese long-nosed snakes, nosy comba ground boas, or Asian rock pythons. However, most impressive to me was actually this massive red tegu. Overall, this is not a spectacular terrarium, but everything here is well designed and furnished, so there's no reason to complain either. And now we are almost done with the lower part of the zoo, but we still need to talk about Rakos House, an area for rare parrots. It was opened in September of 2019 and consists of a building with various indoor enclosures and 2 connected aviaries. The first being a very well-designed habitat for keas, which I always love to see, but they can be found in 75 different zoos in Europe, and I'm not sure if that qualifies as rare. However, pescat parrots, yellow-billed amazons, and palm cockatoos do live up to what this area promises, and Lear's macaques can only be found in 5 different zoos across the world. In total, the house consists of 6 geographical biotope exhibits, one of which, the lowland forests of New Guinea, is walked through. Not only parrots live in those biotopes, but also a number of other birds, including spotted imperial pigeons who can only be found in 3 different zoos in Europe, black-chinned fruit doves can only be found in 2, wattled chicanas in 7, and Reggiana birds of paradise only in 3 different zoos in Europe. So if you're into birds, Rakos House is definitely for you. And the final walk-through aviary, which is designed to represent the habitat of an Andean foothill, is another real highlight. All in all, I really liked this area. It feels and is very modern, so it would also make for a good start to the zoo if you choose your route accordingly. Because yes, after more than 15 minutes, we finally completed our tour of the lower part of the zoo, and I think you would agree that it would make for a good zoo on its own already, but we are not even halfway through Prague Zoo, so avanti amigos, we still have a lot of ground to cover. Right next to the main entrance is this enclosure, where you can find red pandas, and behind it the path leads to the upper part of the zoo. And there, the next highlight awaits us immediately, because here we can immerse ourselves in the Indonesian rainforest. This house was built between 2001 and 2004, and at the time it was the most expensive building project in the history of Prague Zoo. And the visitors' experience here definitely still holds up. Starting right with the entrance atrium, where various aquaria represent an Indonesian river system, and there is a big map showcasing the region we are about to explore. Right around the corner, we once again come eye to eye with more Komodo dragons, but these guys are quite a lot bigger than the ones we saw at the giant tortoises. Then we make our way right into the center of the jungle, the lower part of the greenhouse, where you will find a monkey island on the left side. To be more precise, this island is home to a group of southern pigtailed macaques. On the other side, you can find smooth-coated otters that share their enclosure with binturongs, which sadly didn't show. Both of these enclosures are beautifully designed and embedded into the jungle, yet unfortunately, to my knowledge, none of the animals here have any outdoor enclosures. And I found the macaque island in particular particular to be rather small. Next up, we are entering a cave with various nocturnal animals. Those are always a nightmare to film. However, I think I captured some decent footage of Luzon giant cloud rats, as well as this ground couscous. My highlight here definitely were the Chinese pangolins, which in Europe can otherwise only be found in Leipzig, which makes it all the more exciting that in 2023 they had breeding success for the first time ever in Europe. At the end of the cave, the path leads up to the upper part of the greenhouse. Here you can immerse yourself even deeper into the jungle, where you could also discover free-flying birds. Also, there are enclosures here for Philippine porcupines, as well as northern tree shrews. But the main attraction here are definitely the orangutans, where I was quite happy to at least get a short look at their baby. They live here in two separate enclosures that you can look into across a moat. And once again, the enclosures aren't exactly spacious. However, they at least have an outdoor enclosure, which was added in 2005. It's 350 square meters in size, which is not that big either. And since orangutans have to be separated sometimes, the animals can probably only enter the outdoor enclosure in rotation. And so, unfortunately, I have to conclude that this greenhouse is beautiful, a great visitor experience, but animal husbandry is not at the best level. So even though all of this still looks very modern on the surface, upon closer inspection you can just spot that this facility is already around 20 years old. However, all of this is still avant-garde compared to the polar bear enclosure. It's not quite as terrible as it looks here. There is a second enclosure and that one is a lot bigger in comparison, but still, this is obviously very outdated in every regard. It's probably the worst polar bear enclosure I've seen in recent years. So thankfully, I already knew that they are currently working on a new polar bear enclosure at a different part of the zoo, so it's getting better real soon. And when the polar bears are finally moving out, this space becomes available to build something new. And I was kind of hoping that they would build a second orangutan enclosure here. Instead of that, Zoo Prague was planning on using this area for giant pandas, but as far as I know, this will no longer come to fruition. And now the current plan is to still build this new bear area, but for a different species of bears. My money is either on sun bears, since they would fit in really well with the Indonesian themed area, or spectacled bears, because they are living in mountain areas, and as you can see from this gorgeous view, that would fit here as well. From here, along the top of the cliff, the path leads past some more aviaries, where you can marvel at many beautiful parakeets and lorises, some of which are kept very rarely. And then we reach what is actually the newest area of the park. Just opened in March of 2024, here you can immerse yourself in the desert gobi. The heart of this area is the enclosure for Przewalski horses, which honestly on its own right isn't that special, but I really like the theming surrounding it. There is a tent where you can get all sorts of information surrounding the reintroduction of Przewalski horses. In case you didn't know, they were once extinct in the wild. So Przewalski horses are a very good example how zoos can help with conservation. There are also these two enclosures with palace cats. They also live in the Gobi Desert, which extends in the south of Mongolia and the north of China. And as you can see, I was lucky enough to catch them at feeding time, and seeing just how shy these cats act is just very fascinating. Last but not least, there's also this house where you can inform yourself further about the region, and there are terrariums with smaller desert creatures. So all in all, I think this is a really well-designed modern complex, but most of the grounds in the upper part of the zoo are rather older and, in my opinion, kind of dull. That doesn't mean that the enclosures mostly housing hoofed animals are bad. Mostly it's just unimpressive and, well, kind of boring to look at. Let me symbolize what I mean by that. Here in the plains region there are prairie dogs, and right behind them are the American bisons, but they didn't achieve any sort of panoramic view. Instead you're just looking at this wall. Yeah, that's exciting. So honestly, this area has nothing much going for it, besides of course this amazing view outside of the zoo. The northern forest area also has not really any modern exhibits, but since fittingly everything here is embedded in this lush forest area, it's nowhere near as dull, quite the opposite. I think most of it is rather charming. You can find different species of deer here, including European elks or reindeers. There is this rather big enclosure for wolves, some aviaries for hawks and owls, and even enclosures for Amur tigers and Amur leopards. Nothing here is really spectacular, but it's all very idyllic, so I don't really mind. And yes, this is also the area where the new polar bear enclosure is currently being built. The last two areas on this plateau are called Across the Continents and Australia. Here you will find some more kangaroos and wallabies, as well as cassowaries and emus. Across the Continents, however, is not really a themed area at all. It does not have a concept, it's just a bunch of animals living in, well, once again, rather dull enclosures. There are some decent ones, like this one for American otters, but I mean, come on, look at this maned wolves enclosure. That's just... It's really boring. It's really boring, isn't it? Well, at least some really interesting species do live here. For example, bush dogs or rarities like jaguarundis. And I was especially excited to see a brown hyena because they can only be found in 5 different facilities all over Europe. Thankfully, now once again we make it to a more modern area of the zoo, although Africa Up Close was actually also opened in 2004, so once again it's 20 years old. And just like with the Indonesian jungle, everything here still looks very modern, but most of the enclosures are rather on the smaller side. Just look at the porcupine enclosure, for example, that's just not very big. So you might have already guessed, this is an area for smaller African animals. And starting on the outside, within this rocky territory are a lot of different animal species to be found. My highlights here were the bat-eared foxes and the honey badgers. They can only be found in 10 different zoos across Europe. I only otherwise know them from Tierpark Berlin. And this enclosure right here is way better, so let me be clear, it's not all bad here. You can also see them in their indoor enclosures, where this area really lives up to its name. I mean, you can come very close to the animals. And here inside the house you can spend a lot of time because it's really rich in species. Mostly a lot of mice and also reptiles, especially lizards. There are some insects here as well, but also white-fronted lemurs. So, like I said, there is a lot to discover, and I really like this area overall, though it's definitely not perfect. Sadly, the hippo house was closed, but we did catch them outside anyway. Including the almost obligatory underwater view, this enclosure is absolutely fine overall, and maybe they even sometimes connect it to the bongo enclosure behind it, which would be great because then the hippos could also have some grass under their feet for once. Moving past more enclosures for hoofed animals that are beautifully embedded in the lush green surrounding them, we now make our way to the Elephant Valley. Like we established, the elephants used to live in the lower part of the zoo, but after the devastating flood of 2002, plans emerged to relocate them here, and in 2012 their new enclosures were finally opened. The elephants have 3 enclosures in total, covering 8,500 500 square meters. This makes it possible to rotate the herd and the bulls, or to work in one enclosure without having to lock the animals inside. The house can also be entered via an elevated path. Here you can learn a lot about the elephants living here as well as the facility, but the actual view inside of the elephant housing is not really appealing. Functionally, everything seems to be fine, but it's not pretty. Let's just say the outdoor enclosures are definitely more appealing to look at. The elevated pathway mentioned earlier also leads into the last area of the zoo. Here you will get this iconic view of the African savannah that you might have already seen beforehand. Alongside the giraffes you will find different species of antelopes here, as well as zebras and ostriches, so basically everything you expect from an African savannah exhibit. Right next to it is also an enclosure for meerkats. And inside the African house, you can not only take a look into the indoor enclosures of the animals living on the African savannah, you will also find dik-diks and aardvarks living here. And thankfully I was lucky, the aardvarks were active and I could film some really great footage here. Back outside we make our way right next to the large African savannah area towards the last and perhaps even biggest highlight of the zoo. Because now we finally arrived at the new gorilla enclosure. Well, actually the Dja Reserve is a little bit more than that. This area was named after a nature reserve in Cameroon, and alongside lowland gorillas, quite a few other species from this area are living here. There are fruit bats, gaboon telepoints, as well as the Brazos monkeys and red river hogs, who interestingly enough share their exhibit. And the gorillas also have roommates, black and white colobuses. And this house is actually the biggest house in Prague Zoo. Accordingly, the indoor facilities are spacious and you can wonderfully observe the animals thanks to these large glass facades. And yes, there are also outdoor enclosures for the animals, so they have a lot of space in total. Sadly, I couldn't find any exact numbers, but this is definitely one of the bigger gorilla indoor enclosures I've ever seen, and there is even more space behind the scenes, and the outdoor enclosure is also rather big. There are climbing structures, a small pond, and thankfully instead of a moat, a dry ditch is used as an enclosure boundary. And from a visitor's perspective, I also like that they have set up stands, both outside and inside. That makes it way more bearable that there can be a lot of people here, especially around feeding time. And who can blame them? Because of course, everyone wants to take a look at the two youngest of the group especially. Moby and Gaia were both born earlier this year, and having such a double breeding success in a new enclosure is of course simply brilliant. But even besides that, this is brilliant designed and probably my favorite area in the zoo. So if everything here were at this level, there would be no question that Prague Zoo is rightly considered to be one of the best zoos in the world. But that is simply not the case. Instead, I found quite a few areas of the zoo really underwhelming. At least if you come with the expectation that this is one of the greatest zoos ever. And I do understand why a lot of people are saying that. It's a big zoo, there are a lot of animals, quite a few rare species as well, and most of the park is really beautiful. And aside from the polar bear enclosure, nothing here is terrible. But to be honest, in my opinion, most of the enclosures are just mediocre. Even the more modern ones are currently neither breathtaking nor groundbreaking, at least for the most part. So I really hope that the new polar bear area will be on the same level as the Dja Reserve, and that some more big upgrades will follow, for example for big cats. Because honestly, right now, while this is an absolutely amazing zoo, I think its status as one of the best zoos in the world can certainly be questioned, especially because there are quite a few parks that may be smaller and show fewer animals, but are more consistent in their presentation and also have more state-of-the-art animal enclosures. But please don't take this too negatively. It's still a really great zoo. So if you are in Prague, it is absolutely worth seeing. And if you are a zoo fan, Prague Zoo definitely needs to be on your bucket list. Just don't expect it to be the best zoo you've ever seen, and maybe you will even disagree with me on that. So I would love to hear your opinions on Prague Zoo in the comments. Can you understand why I don't rank the zoo at the very top? Let me know if you agree or disagree, though I have to say, if you have seen the top 10 of my favorite zoos in Europe, Prague Zoo is still probably number 11. Also, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet, ring the bell, then you won't miss out when our journey through the world of zoos continues. I have so many more parks to show you, as you can see, including some more from the Czech Republic, because overall it's a really great country for zoos. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. See you soon, or as we say in Germany, auf Wiedersehen.